Shall we start Esther?
Yes, we're in Esther.
How many of you read it this week since you got the heads up? Okay. Fascinating book. Wait, where's my clicker?
When did we get the heads up? Last week?
Yeah. Here's your heads up for next week, Daniel.
Okay.
So Esther is the name of the book. In Hebrew, it's that name, Esther. One of those that actually, the full name is Megillot Esther. Megillot means scroll there. Esther is a fascinating name. It's the name of the main character. By the way, one of only 2 books in the Bible named after women, Ruth and Esther. So in that sense, interesting and an outlier. So there it is. What's the meaning of the name? Now, this is an interesting thing because depending can mean one of 2 things. We know that Esther could be derived from the Persian name of the goddess Ishtar, which is an old Mesopotamian, actually the oldest recorded, like in some sort of written form, God reference that we have is Ishtar. Ishtar would be a god of, well, lots of things, including war and sex. So there you go. And so what we have is possibly, and the most direct line for this name is Persian or Mesopotamian that relates to that. Ishtar, the word star, this goddess is associated, as you would expect, with the planet Venus. And the word itself can mean star, and we know Venus is a planet. But then it would just be it would be one of the brighter stars, if not the brightest star in the sky. And often the heavens were associated with gods. Now, we also know in the book of Esther that her Hebrew name is not Esther. She has another name, and that is Hadassah, which means myrtle. And myrtle trees in Israel are considered to stand for the righteous. So we've got this name, which makes sense. And by the way, this next section, we're going to be in the exilic period with Esther, with Daniel, with Ezra, with Nehemiah, and then the Chronicles are written in the late exile, post-exilic period. So the last part of the Hebrew Bible we're considering over the next several weeks is all written in this period. And several of those individuals have names given them by the Babylonians in captivity. For instance, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are not their Hebrew names. Their Hebrew names are in the book of Daniel. Daniel is his Hebrew name, but he's given a Babylonian name. And the same thing happens here with Esther. Her Hebrew name, Hadassah, versus her name there. But here's the interesting thing. The root of this word, Esther, has a meaning in Hebrew, and it is to hide or conceal. So it seems an appropriate Hebrew, if we just take the root of that word, the 3-letter consonant root of that word, it means to hide or conceal. And part of the story of Esther is she was told to what? Hide her Jewish identity. So it fits. And it hits even at the name, her name and the name of the book, at one of the key things that's happening in the book. So the name itself isn't surprising. It's the same name in English and in Hebrew, but the meaning of that name already gives us some clues that some things are going on here. Probably the most interesting part, or the most often cited little nugget about the book of Esther, is that nowhere in it is the name of God. God is not mentioned. Faith is not mentioned. None of that stuff is in there. But it is a key book for the observance of one of the Jewish festivals. This section of the Hebrew Bible, the 5 scrolls, there's the English transliteration of scroll, Megillot. Have you heard the phrase, the whole Megillah? Mm-hmm. Right? It's the Jewish form of Megillot. It's the whole scroll. You read the whole thing. So it's a Yiddish form of the Hebrew. So these 5 scrolls these 5 books of the Hebrew Bible are used in 5 key festivals in Israel. This is the only one that's not biblical, we said, was this one. And the book of Esther is the actual story that inspires the festival of Purim. So there you go. The reason Esther is read at Purim is because the story and the command to observe Purim is in Esther. I think it's chapter 9, if I'm not mistaken. So the book seems to focus specifically on that particular thing. Now, the name Purim, if you've read through, you notice that this word, at least the first 3 letters, show up several times. If most English translations note that. This word means lot or lottery. How's that? So Jews are in favor of the lottery. No, that's not the point here. The reason it's called that is because featuring in the book is a lot that is drawn to decide the date on which the Jewish people will be exterminated. The order that Haman convinces Xerxes to sign that will do away with all the Jewish people is decided by lot or by pure, P-U-R. The I-M, if you remember, I've said this before, but to remind you, it's plural. It's like our S in Hebrew, I-M, eem is plural, like Elohim. The I-M means gods, but it's used as a name of the one true God. And often we talk about that as the kind of the hint at the Trinity, but nonetheless, that ending is plural. So it's a festival based upon that. In fact, here's one of the verses in there. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, chapter 3, verse 7, in the first month, the month of Nissan. So here we go. I didn't bring the calendar along. If you remember, Nissan is the month of Passover. It's not the month of Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is in the fall. Nissan is in the spring. So in the Babylonian captivity or the Persian captivity days, they're going by the biblical order of months. The first month is Nissan. The lot, the pure, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and month, and the lot fell in the 12th month, the month of Adar. And that's when the decree would go out and be executed, as the Jews, I guess, would be also executed. Yeah, there it is. So that's where the festival gets its name. I looked into it. I think it's kind of interesting. I said, I'm not familiar with the festival of Purim. So I said, let's find out how they celebrate. Are you ready? There are 4 commands that any good and observant Jew keeps around Purim. Number 1, read the scroll. You do it in the evening. If you remember in the Hebrew way of thinking, the day starts at sunset. So it's sometime between sunset and you go to bed on the first, as Purim starts, you read the scroll of Esther. And then the next day, you read it again. Usually you read it at home, and then you read it in the synagogue as you celebrate in the service. Now, here's a cool thing that happens in the reading of the scroll of Esther around Purim. Whenever the name of Haman is read, the people hiss, stomp their feet, or they have these like noise makers. What are they called? I think I wrote it down. Graggers. I don't know what those are. I looked, but I saw it in several Jewish websites. Graggers. They make noise so that the name of Haman, you never hear it, even when the rabbi or somebody's reading it. So can you imagine? You're sitting in, and Haman, if you've read it, shows it's not a name that shows up once or twice. It shows up several times. So whenever his name is coming, and the people know the book, I mean, it's just this cacophony of noise so that his name is never heard. Doesn't that sound like fun? Maybe we should try it. What word should we use Sunday? Just you will know if I say it. Okay, maybe we shouldn't do that. But the kids are told this is the only time you're allowed to be disrespectful in the synagogue, is in the reading of Esther around Purim.
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
What timeline is this? This is obviously before Christ.
It's, we'll have the timeline events about, it's in the 400 or 500 BC.
Okay, thank you.
I forget. I don't have it.
Okay, that's close. But that makes sense.
586 BC is the beginning of the captivity where they take the Israelites. Babylon is in charge. Esther happens during the Persian part of history. So Babylon With Nebuchadnezzar has faded, Persia has risen.
Okay.
So that's several years.
Because you're talking about somebody drawing lots to knock off the Jews.
Obviously, they did.
This would have to be, you said this is under Xerxes.
Xerxes is the
So this would be the second
Persian ruler.
Okay.
Is that the Ottoman Empire?
No, Persian.
Persian.
Persian
So what do
Empire.
they call them? Just that?
The Medo-Persian or Persian Empire.
Okay.
Darius the Mede, the handwriting on the wall in Daniel
Yeah.
is the night when Babylon falls and the Medo-Persian Empire rises
Okay.
in this area, and they take over. So, command number 1, read the scroll and make lots of noise so we don't have to hear the bad guy's name. Command number 2, you give at least 2 gifts, food or money, to anyone who's needy. So you send it usually by courier. You don't take it yourself. Couriers go all over. Number 3, so needy. Oh, and here's another rule. On Purim, if anybody asks for help, you're supposed to give it to them. So if you're in Israel and you're driving down the road and somebody says, we'll work for food, guess what? You got to give to them. No choice. Somebody stops you at the grocery store on the way out. Hey, can you spare a couple bucks? Because I'm hungry. You got to give to them. That's just a rule. This idea that this people of Israel, and these next 2 commands, giving to the needy and sending food gifts to friends, are related to the fact that as a people, they were threatened. And so Purim is a reminder that this is a community, that they're all interconnected as a people, not just individuals. They need and relate to each other. And so that's the third. And so they celebrate by giving gifts to the needy and sending food gifts to friends. There's actually a particular pastry. It's usually a triangular. I forget the name of it. It has Haman's name somehow in it. It's like a jelly-filled thing. And that's like a treat around Purim. It's supposed to symbolize Haman's ear or his crown that got ripped off because he went from hero to goat in the story. And then the 4th thing is you eat and drink to excess. How's that? This is a command. The 4th century rabbi, Rava, said, you drink until you don't know the difference between cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordecai. I mean, like falling down drunk is the goal of this festival. So there you go. There's this whole rabbinic tradition of, like I said, to excess, not just a little bit, but a whole lot.
How many days does this last?
Just one. Good thing. Yeah, just one. So you have a really bad day. Starts at sundown, usually on the 13th of Adar, and then the 14th is the day. You know, sundown starts the 14th, but it would be on the 13th of Adar. And actually, it's weird. If you're in the country, it's on the 13th and 14th. If you're in the city, it's on the 14th and 15th. So there you go. It took longer. This is the reasoning. The day that the lot fell originally to extinguish the Jews became the day they got their revenge on the people trying to extinguish, on Haman and his family. And so it took longer in the bigger cities to take out all the people that were related to him and that they were trying to get. So it took an extra day. So in the big cities, it's a day later. In the country, it's a day earlier. So it's kind of weird, but just a day. So not most of their festivals are a week or something. So yeah, that would be rough. But just one day of falling down drunk. And like I said, it's a command. So here we go. Todd, to answer your question, timeline.
Thank you.
What we're going to be doing, as I said, for the rest of our time in the Hebrew Bible is in the exilic, or actually the post-exilic time period. So here's kind of a timeline that's going to put these last books in order. We are in Esther, which is here. You see it's in the 480, 475, 485, somewhere in that regard. If you look at the book we're going to do next, Daniel happens before. Daniel comes very early after the fall because he is part of the Babylonian captivity before the Persians take over. And then Ezra actually is split. The first 6 chapters of Ezra happen before Esther, and the next 4 chapters of Ezra happen after Esther, and then Nehemiah comes along. There's 3 returns from captivity back to Israel by the people of God. And so the decree of Cyrus is the first, the temple, and we've got Ezra coming, we've got the temple, we've got down here, it mentions the prophets. We talked about Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi over here. Then Ezra comes with the second, Zerubbabel comes with the first, Ezra comes with the second group, Nehemiah comes with the third group. He's doing the wall. So Zerubbabel gets back, they try to get the temple going. Ezra leads the reforms to reinstitute the worship of everything. Nehemiah rebuilds the wall. In the middle of this kind of timeline is Esther. It's just a 10, 15 year slice we're seeing in the book of Esther here. And while Daniel is in captivity, Ezra moves back to Jerusalem. Esther is in captivity. Ezra and Nehemiah move back to Jerusalem. So this is where we are in the history of the people of God. And so I know we're a little out of order in that. You would think we do Daniel and move on, but Esther falls in those 5 scrolls. So we were considering those together. So it's kind of in this time frame. Yes, sir.
Now, where does God declare that he is here in Jerusalem? On this timeline?
Well,
you realize what you understand what I'm
if you remember when we studied Ezekiel had the vision.
Bible, I guess it's got to be in the New Testament or the Old Testament somewhere.
When you mean God is here, like in this,
where he declares that he is in Jerusalem.
Well, that's going to go way back here.
Okay, so that's why I figured it had to be before all this. Okay,
about 1000 BC.
Okay.
David and Solomon.
That makes sense. Okay.
When David makes Jerusalem the capital,
okay,
he brings the ark to Jerusalem.
Okay.
From, I forget the city, and then his son Solomon actually builds the temple.
Right.
That's about 1010.
That's why Solomon built the temple in the first place, because God said it was.
Right.
Okay.
So the presence of God at the dedication of the temple comes at that point. Ezekiel, the prophet, writes, he is in captivity. He's by the river in Babylon, which is Bar River, and he sees the presence of God leave the temple. He has that vision where the presence goes from over the Ark of the Covenant to the door, to the wall, to the Mount of Olives, and gone. And the temple chariot throne comes to visit him there. So that's like scandalous in the people of Israel's mind. So during this time, that's why part of what they're doing, they're going to rebuild the altar and lay the temple foundation. Because
I see Daniel's there, and that was who was in control?
Nebuchadnezzar was the Babylonian king that destroyed the temple.
Okay.
Desecrated the temple.
Right.
When he overthrew Jerusalem. 586, it fell. Ezekiel got word, and about a little over half of the way through his book, that Jerusalem has fallen. You get the raggedy guy comes back and says Jerusalem has fallen. So there's people in captivity before Jerusalem falls. There's 3 waves of exiles that leave Jerusalem, and now there's 3 waves of returnees that go back.
Yeah.
So Jerusalem has fallen. Some have already gone back, and they've begun to try to rebuild parts of the temple, get the altar, reinstitute the sacrificial system, and all of that. When we come to this slice,
now we're at Esther. Okay.
We're in Esther. Esther is not back. She is in captivity still. She and Mordecai and all of the rest. So this story doesn't happen in Israel. It happens in Persia, in the Medo-Persian Empire, particularly in the capital city, because the king, Xerxes, is involved. Now, there's a lot of question about Esther itself. Susa. I got a map in just a minute. Susa is the capital city. I believe it's, from early on, it tells us that's where it's happening. So there's a lot of question about the book of Esther itself. If we were looking at the New Testament, there was a process of having all of these books become what we call the canon of the New Testament. And there were a few that were controversial. One that a lot of people didn't like was James. James was works. to many people. Martin Luther particularly didn't like it at all. You know, you got Hebrews, which is faith, James, which is works. He wanted to throw it out even though it was already in. So there was some discussion early on. We don't have a fully formed canon of the New Testament because after the days of Jesus, it took some time for that, a couple hundred years, for the books that were generally recognized as authoritative to finally be recognized formally at a church council. By the way, just for point of reference, the New Testament canon wasn't set arbitrarily, like there were these competing lists of books that they finally had a church council and decided we're going to go with this list. No, generally the canon, meaning the New Testament, the 27 books of the New Testament, were largely widely accepted by most Christians. And the council that eventually set the canon just agreed that these books that most believers in Jesus considered authoritative would become the New Testament or become biblical. It wasn't a controversy. There are those in popular literature have tried to say there are all these books that were there. Generally, the books like, for instance, the big one was Dan Brown. What was it called? Da Vinci Code talked a lot about Gnostic Gospels. The Gnostic Gospels were never really considered by believers true authoritative books. A, because they weren't written by apostles, even though it says the Gospel of Thomas. They weren't written until after 200 AD. Thomas was long dead and martyred from India by then. So in that period of time, they knew this book wasn't original. It hadn't been around from the days of Jesus by an apostle. So it wasn't even considered, but there's some of that controversy. But the Old Testament canon is a little different. We're taking the Hebrew canon. Go ahead, Doreen.
Was the Old Testament ever written by itself as a Bible? I know that, but as the Christians, we always had the Old and the New together.
Well, because
but they're 400 years apart.
This format didn't exist until the printing press,
Right.
which is very recent.
Yeah.
What? 1700s? Maybe, I don't know. I'd have to look up Gutenberg.
Yes, when I was young, I was given a book. It was by itself. It said New Testament, and it was just a New Testament.
Right, and you can do that.
Okay.
And so there are those. But that's why we said, like, this section of the Hebrew writing is called the Five Scrolls, because Esther was its own scroll, because they didn't have ways to mass produce large volumes. It was handwritten until technology, many, many, many centuries later, caught up. So what we have, and probably one of the more helpful discoveries, was the Dead Sea Scrolls in Israel, which had collections of these scrolls. But again, there wasn't like one, like this box said Old Testament on it.
Yeah.
It just, where you could find it would be the Torah Scrolls in the synagogues that would have been Jewish heritage, that would have been hand copied. That was where most Jews would have any interaction with a written copy of the text up until the last 400 or 500 years of their existence. If they wanted to see a physical copy, that's where they would find it. Most every synagogue invested in that. And you can go down to our Jewish Community Center here, and they have a scroll that was rescued out of the Holocaust. It was in a synagogue that was destroyed, and the Torah scroll was nearly destroyed, but somehow, as those were recovered, they got a copy, which is really cool. I got to see it. Don't think he let me touch it, but he let me look at it.
Did you get to see any original scrolls while you were in Jerusalem?
There is a wonderful exhibit at the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran that, much to my chagrin, we did not have time to tour.
I'm sure you were very busy.
When we were at the Weeping Wall, there was a room down underneath there that those Jews were going and pulling out scrolls.
There were lots of scrolls in there, as well as other bound volumes that were more recent than the scrolls. There is, under the Wailing Wall, there's an enclosed area full of people praying with many old copies. But yeah, so to say, the way we think of books is so different than the way Jesus' people would have. There was, that's not how it worked back then.
Well, the only way that they could pass down the scrolls was by the
somebody had to hand
holy
copy it.
men would hand it to their kids, and they would be holy men and to their kids. And who was entrusted with the scrolls and passed it along.
Right.
Would be the only way to make it common.
And because of the nature of them, they would be considered very valuable. There weren't that many.
Absolutely.
They weren't just passed around. So, when we talk about the Old Testament canon, we have the benefit that by about 200 BC, what we call the Old Testament was pretty much considered by Hebrews their Bible.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't go to the bookstore. You couldn't order on Amazon in 200 BC, but it was very well considered. Now, to that point, I mentioned Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of the interesting things they say about that is there was no scroll of Esther found in Qumran. Why that happened? Some people say that's evidence that there were some that didn't think it was authoritative because it happened in captivity. It was a Jewish woman who married a pagan king, which would certainly be against the rules of Jewish thought. And so there has been some question, not to us. It's been in our Bible for as long, when the New Testament canon kind of was officially recognized by the councils 325, the Old Testament was assumed. And what we have as the Old Testament has been the same since then because we just took it from the Hebrew people. But there is some, it's not really debate. That's not the right word. There are some that have questioned Esther's canonicity. Is it really biblical? One, because there's no mention of God and faith and all kind of the basic things that you would expect would be in, a book like that. And it's never quoted in the New Testament. There's no Esther quotes in the New Testament. Esther is a lot of Old Testament books are. So New Testament apostles, the early Christians didn't even quote it. So why should we keep it? There are a few other reasons, but nonetheless. Now, then you add to that the fact there are those who have questions about its historicity because it seems to exist simply to validate this festival of Purim. That the whole book, for some, this is what some would say, not me, by the way, this isn't my words, I'm just kind of giving you the broad picture. Some would say they came up with this book simply to justify having this big festival. They don't think it's history. Part of it is the way, it's a narrative book. That's fair to say. It's a story. It tells a story. Much different than what we've been looking at recently. It's not prophetic. Doesn't have that sense to it. It's not poetic and all of that. In fact, there is a Greek version of the book of Esther that adds over 100 verses specifically to introduce God and things of God into the story. Over 100 verses added. There's a song of Mordecai. There are prayers of Mordecai and Esther that are in there. But it wasn't as early as Jerome in the 4th century AD. And Jerome is the scribe who translated the Bible into Latin, both the Old and New Testament. He turned the Hebrew into Latin. He turned the Greek into Latin. So the Latin Vulgate, which is a very important translation along the way. Jerome, by the time he's doing his thing, he didn't include those verses. He didn't recognize them as authoritative. So we can't say there's controversy about that. They were never really considered. And it seems like they were added specifically to say, let's make Esther look more like a good Jewish book. We've got to talk about God. We've got to talk about faith. And instead, you've got a book that, I don't know, some people say it reads like a novel, like a fictional story. And part of that is there hasn't been a lot of corroboration as well on some of the main characters that play out in the story. I mean, Xerxes, we know, but Mordecai and Esther or Hadassah or Haman, we don't find a lot of reference to them. We don't find reference to Queen Vashti, who was the key player before Esther comes on, the queen before Esther. And so some people say it's just evidence that is there. But there is one verse that seems to indicate that Esther was put together as a historical document. It's in the last chapter. The last chapter of Esther is terribly short. It's just like 3 verses, maybe 4. And in verse 2, it says this: all his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? There's Medo-Persian Empire. So in Esther itself, the author is saying, if you want to know more, there are documents, there are historical documents that talk about this. Now, we don't have complete copies of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia because they'd be really, really old. And as we know, documents don't last for that sort of thing. But based upon, we might say, the internal evidence, outside of some of the other things we've said, Esther purports itself to be a historical book. So my take is we take it at its word, as it were, and look at it and say, yes, I think this is a book that has historicity to it. It might have elements that are particularly fantastic and literary, but that doesn't mean a really well-told story can't be true. And it also says something I've said a lot. It reminds us that in the scriptures, we have at times some really amazing pieces of literature, which we should treasure, that these things that others would look at and discount, that we have as kind of the background of our faith, the backstory of our faith, all of these incredible documents and the incredible literary. It's a very unique piece of literature, unlike most other things in the Hebrew Bible, because it is more literary in some of its ways. It makes use of irony and reversals and certain things that are not common. And we'll look at that as we go. So it purports itself to be history. So we're going to take it as history, in case you're wondering where we land. Here is the Persian Empire. It's big. Chapter 1, verse 1 tells us this is what happened during the time of Xerxes. The Xerxes who ruled over the 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. India and Kush is northern Egypt. So, and I think this is interesting. Notice the borders of this empire. And what do we find right here? Israel. Here we go. Here it is. And why? Because this is the land bridge. Everything about this area, which week 2 or 3 of our time together, we talked about that. And so we've got this massive empire. Susa is right here, the capital, where things happen, or Shushan, as it's called, but we abbreviated to Susha. The limits go up here to Greece, as Greece began to rise. When Daniel, we've got the empires, we'll talk about that, the vision and all, Nebuchadnezzar with the Babylonians, the Medo-Persian, and the Greek Empire. It began to push back against Persia. They had a few incursions here that they lost. One of the first places that showed the potential weakness of their empire. But other than that, that's a massive empire that Xerxes is over. Here's another timeline, just a reminder that, where we are. We've moved from Babylonian to Persian rule in this story. So that's a little bit of the background of the book of Esther. Any more comments, questions, thoughts? Okay, let's talk about the story flow. This one's easier to outline. I said with Ecclesiastes, it was tough. How do you outline a book that is that? Proverbs, tough. Well, Esther, we just say we're outlining the story. For the first couple of chapters tell us how Esther goes from a nobody to queen. Fascinating story. If you're familiar with it, King Xerxes is celebrating. He has a 6-month party. And after he has a 6-month party, he has another party, because the first 6-month party wasn't enough. And it's at the second party that he tells us that everything really gets going. He has about a week-long feast where the wine flows. And when he's in high spirits, he calls for his queen and wants her to come to show her off because of her great beauty. And what does she say? Ain't no way. Not going to do it. You figure in that day, a queen known for her beauty being paraded in front of her powerful husband and his friends who are all stone cold drunk. It's probably, she's having her own party, but she's hosting her own party over here. He's hosting his. She says no. His advisors say, well, then she got to go. We can't have that, because if she says no to you, our wives will say no to us, and that'll be really bad. And so Vashti's gone. So he decides, because he's king, I guess, and rules all that empire, I need a new wife. So he rounds up all the pretty women in the empire, and they come in and take turns. He takes turns with them until he decides who he wants. It talks about this elaborate ritual they have to go to before they're taken in to be with Xerxes, and incredible amount of treatments and such they do. And Esther,
he's sleeping with all of them as he's testing them.
Absolutely.
But what about virgins? Wasn't that important to them?
Well, yeah. Well,
but they weren't anymore.
Not after he was done with them. And so there you go. It's good to be the king, in the words of Mel Brooks.
Yeah, but then he ruins them because men wanted virgins to get married.
But the seconds from the king aren't so bad. And even if they don't become his queen, they might make the harem and get all the benefits of being in the palace and all the wealth and power that comes with living in the palace as part of the king's harem. Like Solomon, right? What is 700 wives, 300 wives, 700 concubines, 1,000 women in his harem? It's not unusual.
Well, you're talking about a time when proper.
Sure.
They didn't hold office. The closest thing you can get holding office was marriage.
Which is why what Queen Vashti did was so offensive, and why she's out, and why what Esther will do in the story also was so dangerous. So she comes to power. She rises to be the queen of that incredible empire. She has an uncle, Mordecai, who's taken her in and raised her. And he factors in the next part of the story. Haman, the bad guy, I just said his name. You're supposed to hiss and so every time I say Haman, I want to hear you hiss and stomp. Okay? So Haman doesn't like the Jews because Mordecai refuses to pay him honor, to bow to him. And so he goes to the king and says, we need to get rid of this guy and all of his people, the Jews. That's when the lot happens. Chapter 3, we read that verse. And Xerxes makes a decree that in the month of Adar, which is several months down the road, all of the Jews will be gone.
Well, that would be a very large execution.
Yes, it would.
Because the Jews were probably half the population.
Well, remember, already two groups of Jews have gone back to Israel. So
that's what you said all the time.
These are the ones who've stayed. Probably because they have gotten a little comfortable in the Babylonian captivity. And the thought of going back to a city that's in ruins and houses that are in ruins and starting over isn't as appealing as just dealing with the mess they're in captivity. There's a lesson there, right?
Well, when you only have a lifeline of 30 years, shorter.
Yeah. So you want to use it for the best.
As possible, as quickly.
So this happened. So it wouldn't be all of the Jews that were brought in. The number has shrunk. I don't have a number, but it would. Many of them.
Well, you understand my point. They weren't as much part of the population. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry. So
the decree goes out, and then the plan for deliverance. What's the plan for deliverance? Mordecai says to Esther, listen, you're the queen. Can you do something about this? And that's where we see he encourages her to tell the king, hey, look, you can't let this happen. And she says, if I go before the king and he doesn't extend to me his staff, I'm dead. That's the rule. You go before the king unannounced and uninvited, and you could be killed. But nonetheless, she submits. Is that for such a time as this, probably the most well-known phrase from the book of Esther. We'll look at that verse in a minute. That's the plan. So here's what we're going to do. So Esther goes in. Xerxes extends the rod to her, extends the staff to her. She makes a request that she wants to hold a banquet. And right before her first banquet, King Xerxes has insomnia. And while he has insomnia, he's reading through some history, some annals of his reign, and learns about this guy Mordecai, who heard about a plot to assassinate Xerxes. So he just can't sleep that night before Esther's banquet that Haman's going to be invited to. And so he says, we got to do something for this guy. Has anything ever been done for this guy? No. So when Haman gets there, Haman's coming in, wanting to discuss how they can kill all the Jews. And Xerxes asked him, listen, Haman, what should be done for the man the king wants to honor? Haman thinks he's talking about him because he's the only one at this banquet. And so he piles it on thick. He says, you should get some of the royal clothes, and you should get your royal steed, and you should parade the man through the streets of the city and let everybody know as it's proclaimed what he has done. And Xerxes says, good idea, Haman. I want you to be the one who leads the horse that Mordecai, his enemy, is seated on. And so that's the humiliation of Haman. He has to walk through the town praising the guy who he hates because he wouldn't bow down to him as this great hero. Well, that didn't go like he planned. And so there's a second banquet. Esther has the first banquet where that happens. The second banquet happens. And at the second banquet is where she reveals Haman as the bad guy. Haman, in the meantime, his wife said, why don't you erect a gallows? Why don't you erect an execution spot so that when it comes, it can be right out there in public. You're going to go in and ask for his head today. We don't want to wait for the lot. We want to get rid of Haman now. We'll get rid of the rest of the Jews later. Build that gallows. Xerxes finds out Haman's going to kill this guy who saved his life. And guess who gets hoist on his own petard, as the phrase. Haman gets put in the gallows that he built, and he's killed, and the decree goes out that Haman's family should be avenged, or either Mordecai's family should be avenged. And so in chapter 9, all of their enemies are destroyed. The last part of chapter 9 is the establishment of this annual feast that will remember this great day when Israel's enemies were destroyed. In the last couple verses, which is chapter 10, how great is Mordecai. There you go. That's the story of Esther. It's pretty spectacular. It's pretty remarkable. It uses, as we've already seen, these elements of reversal and irony. Mordecai thinking that he's going in talking about killing his enemy, Haman going in thinking he's talking about killing his enemy, Mordecai, and he's going to be exalted. And we see the twist. It's actually Mordecai that's going to be exalted, and Haman will be embarrassed in this. We see him later having the man who wanted to kill the Jews has to beg for his life from the Jewish queen. A little bit ironic. These twists and turns along the way. It's pretty. But the remarkable thing about this book, to go back to the point that most people know about it, is God is not in the forefront. God's not even mentioned in this book. So what do we make of that? If we said long time ago, the books in the Hebrew Bible are not about the characters, not about, in this case, the title character, Esther, they're about God, what does this tell us? Where can we get that? Because this is not the God that we've met in much of the Old Testament, is it? God in the Old Testament is usually right out front. I mean, the seas are parting, the army's getting drowned, the walls of Jericho come tumbling down, the land is conquered, his presence dwells on the mountain and then the temple in tangible ways. It's this awe-inspiring thing. They go to fight, and it says God kills more by a hailstorm than all the armies of Israel killed in the battle. I mean, God is front and center. He's the one doing all of it. And here in this book, nothing. But does that mean he's not at work?
No.
We would have to say, of course not.
Well, didn't Mordecai not bow to
Haman, correct?
Because of his God, or because of God.
It doesn't say God. we read that into him because of his Jewish heritage. But it doesn't make that, because of his faith in God, he refused it. That's not explicit. It's implicit. It's implied in the text. In Daniel, the three friends don't bow, and they're explicit about their faith. Even if you throw us in the fiery furnace, our God, there's no question. Here it's implicit at best, not overt. And the same with much of what God is doing. He's working behind the scenes. And so the question we're struggling with is, can we see God's hand as much at work in a king's bout of insomnia as in a moment where the walls of a city come tumbling down, or the seas part before the people of God so they can cross on dry land? Can we see God in that, in the circumstance, in the coincidence of life, as much as we see it in the unmistakable evidence of his hand? And Esther asks us to grapple with that reality. And it's a tough question.
He probably gave them insomnia for a message.
And so that's what we see. The word we often use is God's sovereignty or divine providence. We don't think of it in terms of it's a coincidence that right before Haman comes in, the king can't sleep and reads the book. We see the unseen hand of God behind the scenes, putting the pieces in order so that those things happen. That's the message, if you will, of the book of Esther. We don't look at the skeptics and say, there is no God. It just was a lucky coincidence. He ate some bad pork. That's why the Jews don't eat pork. It doesn't keep you up at night. But he ate some bad pork, and there you go. But the idea is there's this tension in the narrative, particularly reading it from a Jewish or religious perspective, that where is God? What is God up to? We see a couple of verses where this says, chapter 4, verses 12 through 14.
I like to say something because, you keep saying there's no God saying anything in that book. Yeah. The reason it doesn't has to be, but the way at the time, those people who decided to put the book of Esther, that means that they were back over their ideas, all of them thinking that God is behind. So it's just because a human, at the time, those people who decided, made a title of a book, which means made them think of just like her name, meaning hide or conceal.
Right.
Those are behind the meaning of it. That's the one she was controlling and executing the killing the rest of people the way she did it without knowing anybody, which means, those people decide it is behind back of her conduct, God is behind. I think that's why all these people decided, made out of the book Esther. That was my theory, kind of way.
Sure.
Yeah.
And we even see a couple of times it's hinted at, though God isn't explicitly mentioned. God's not mentioned by name. It doesn't mean he's not at work. And it doesn't mean he's not recognized by the author or the reader.
Right.
From that perspective. Yeah. So here's the part with the most famous verse, I would guess. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. So she was worried, well, I don't want to die. If I go in, he can kill me. So he's saying, look, you might get killed anyway. For if you remain silent at this time, and then here's a fascinating thing, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows, but that you have come to your royal position, there's the phrase, for such a time as this. Maybe God in his sovereignty, we would say, providence has placed you in this position so that for this very moment and for this very reason he could act. But this phrase is also quite interesting to me. Mordecai saying, look, okay, even if you don't act, we're going to be delivered. It just won't be through you. Why is that? That's a statement of faith, isn't it? It doesn't say God will deliver explicitly, but this is a statement of faith. This is a statement of a man.
A matter of fact, it's going to happen.
Though he is in captivity, and though the temple is still in disrepair, and though it looks like all the odds are stacked against he and his people, he is a man of faith that says, we know it's going to happen somewhere. Because God has made promises to us. That's the reason you would say this. Not just because you're wishful thinking. This is a Jewish man who has the covenant promises of God as his history and his background. It's going to come from somewhere. Second place is the most unlikely of people. Haman's wife, Zeresh, said to him, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall is started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. Interesting. So even the pagan, by the way, Haman is in the line of King Agag, an Amalekite, who Saul and Agag, crossed paths. Saul spared him, but this is the line. So from a non-Jewish background saying, hey, look, our family's been around these Jewish folks for a while. We always come out on the wrong end. So what do you think? This is also a statement of faith, though a more negative view of it, because it's not a directly beneficial one for Zeresh and for Haman, but it's an understanding that God has made promises. And isn't much of the story that we've read in the Hebrew Bible about God keeping his promises in the face of insurmountable odds? When it looked like all hope was lost, something happens somewhere, and eventually God's promises to his people attend. One commentator put it this way: this line is evidence that history has a pro-Jewish shape to it. I thought that was an interesting
that's the same verse. You have a curse. People that do not like Jews will be cursed. A friend of the Jews will be blessed.
Back to Abraham, God. Those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse.
That's exactly what they're doing.
The whole bend of history, even to the pagan, the non-Jew, they see the bend of history as that particular bent. And so in the book of Esther, I guess, summary time real quick. Number one, I think it's historical in spite of those who would argue otherwise. Number two, though God isn't explicitly mentioned by name, I think it's obvious, not just in these places, but elsewhere, that faith undergirds the actions of the people. And number three, it should be an encouraging book to us to be reminded of God's divine and sovereign hand over even the seemingly coincidental moments of life. Ultimately, the arc of history bends toward his purposes and his plans. So we can trust him, even when things don't look so great. And there is Esther. Thoughts, comments, questions, complaints? Just for fun.
Good on Zoom.
Where are you? You're freezing? It's a little chilly in here, I agree. All right. Next week, we will look at Daniel, which should be fascinating. Probably a book you know quite a bit about. Daniel's got some well-known stories we're taught when we're just real little kids, and then some pretty sensational parts that can be quite fascinating. We'll talk about that. Yep, that's my last slide. Next Wednesday. So let me pray, and then we'll call it a night. Father in heaven, I'm grateful for your love for us. for the fact that you are at work in history, that you've preserved for us the record of your work in history and what we call the Bible, the Old and New Testaments, the history of your people, Israel, who you called to yourself, who you worked through their history to bring about the promised Messiah, and then the history of your son, Jesus, who lived and died and rose again and forms the basis and the cornerstone of our faith. Lord, we thank you that you have given us these books of Scripture to show us these things so that we can learn from them and see your hand at work, even in what others might label coincidence. We see your providential guidance, your sovereign will, always accomplished. Lord, thank you for that truth and for that reality. I pray, Lord, tonight as we face whatever the rest of this week may hold, that we'll hold fast to that truth and look for ways that you are at work, even in the seemingly simple things, in the ordinary day-to-day things that we might otherwise overlook, that we might recognize in them ways that you are at work, using us and working out through our lives your plans. Thank you that you're our God. Thank you that you've saved us. Thank you that you still work through us today. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.